Often we question, or others will question us, why do we have to go to Mass every Sunday? I remember growing up, I asked that question a number of times to my own parents, why do we need to go every Sunday? And it's because we don't understand and appreciate at that time the great gift that it is to receive our Lord in the Eucharist. Today we celebrate the great feast of Corpus Christi, the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. What a gift that we have received to be able to receive him into our heart, into our soul. Throughout the history of salvation, we see how our Lord has provided for his people, the Israelites, as they were wandering around in the desert. He gave them this manna from heaven, and it was a foretaste of what was to come, this truly heavenly bread. And when we look at this gospel today of John chapter 6, Christ teaches his apostles and many of those who are present that they must eat of his flesh and blood. Now for the Jews, this was something scandalous. It was very difficult to grasp and understand. They had nothing to do with drinking blood or the sacrifice of animals, or to eat flesh, when Christ said to eat his own flesh. And the amazing thing is, when you go to the Greek translation, there are two words that Jesus uses in this discourse. One is trogein, and the other one is phagein. And phagein is more of the everyday use of eating, whereas trogein is almost like this gnawing of something that maybe an animal would do. Right? And so Jesus is speaking about eating his flesh with this normal word, but then to make a point, he uses this word, the other verb, trogein, right? Unless you gnaw on my flesh and drink my blood, right? And so he is trying to help us understand this isn't just a symbol, but this is actually my flesh and blood. And this is a beautiful mystery of our faith, right? That our Lord gives himself to us, body, soul, blood, and divinity in the Eucharist. When I was in Rome for some of my studies, we often, the legionaries, will study our philosophy and theology in Rome. And I was there, I remember in the year 2005, when Pope Benedict gave a general audience to children that had just received their first Eucharist. And he gave them the opportunity to come up to the microphone and to ask him some questions. And one of the first questions that was asked was from a young girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, who asked Pope Benedict about his experience, his first Holy Communion, and I'd like to share with you his response. Pope Benedict says, "I would first like to say thank you for this celebration of faith that you are offering to me, for your presence and for your joy. I remember my first communion very well. It was a lovely Sunday in March of 1936. It was a sunny day. The church looked beautiful. There was music. There were so many beautiful things that I remember. There were about 30 of us, boys and girls, from my little village of no more than 500 inhabitants. But at the heart of my joyful and beautiful memories is this one. I understood that Jesus had entered my heart. He had actually visited me, and with Jesus, God himself was with me. And I realized that this is a gift of love that is truly worth more than all other things that life can give. So on that day, I was really filled with joy because Jesus came to me, and I realized that a new stage in my life was beginning. I was 9 years old, and it was henceforth important to stay faithful to that encounter, to that communion. I promised the Lord as best I could, I would always want to stay with him, and I prayed to him, but above all, stay with me. So I went on living my life like that. Thanks be to God. The Lord has always taken me by the hand and guided me, even in difficult moments. So that day of my first communion was the beginning of a journey made together. I hope that for you too also, the first communion you have received in this year of the Eucharist will be the beginning of a lifelong friendship with Jesus, the beginning of a journey together, because in walking with Jesus, we do well and life becomes good. Just a little after that, another young child, a boy, got up and asked a very difficult question to answer. I remember hearing it and thinking, how would I respond? He said, "Pope Benedict, my parents don't often go to church, but I'd like to invite them to go. I want them to go with me. What can I say to my parents?" So Pope Benedict said, you have to always respect your parents, as we know from the fourth commandment, to honor your father and mother. But he said, you have received this great gift of Jesus in the Eucharist. You know how much he means to you. I invite you to invite them to also come and experience this gift. You can be an instrument in helping them to come to know Jesus in a deeper way, to invite Jesus into their hearts. And so for me, that was a great witness of how we can also be disciples of Christ in bringing this great gift to others, in sharing our own personal experience with those who are seeking or those who may not know Christ the way that we do. And there are many different ways. We have Mass, we have also adoration, to worship our Lord, to adore him, and to welcome him more fully into our lives and into our hearts. In the 13th century, there was a beautiful miracle that took place of the Eucharist. There was a priest who had doubted the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So he had made this pilgrimage, and on his way was stopping in some different cities and would often celebrate Mass. And he was in this small town of Bolsena, and he was celebrating the Eucharist and began to have doubts during the moment of consecration. And as he lifted up the host began to bleed, and drops of blood fell upon the corporal, the piece of cloth on the altar, and even onto the altar itself. And of course, he was very moved by this experience and came to grow in his faith in a very powerful way. Right in that corporal, the piece of cloth is still kept in Bolsena, in a cathedral in that area, where they bring it out so that many people can come to honor and to pray, right, because of that great miracle that took place years ago. And in that 13th century was a time where from that moment on, this Eucharistic adoration began, where people would come and adore Christ in the Eucharist, present in that sense on the altar in a monstrance. And so we have these opportunities to deepen in our faith. We ask our Lord, especially on this great feast of his most holy body and blood, that he help us to come to a deeper understanding of this great gift, but above all to share it with others. That as Catholics, we can go out and proclaim, above all, not just with our words, but with our deeds, of how we truly believe that Christ is with us, even physically, as we receive him in the Eucharist. So let us thank him for this great gift, but also make that promise, as Pope Benedict did when he was 9 years old, that I want to stay with you, and I invite you as well to remain with me.